I'm Dan Meerts, Senior Solutions Architect for Gremlin. Joining us today is Don Darwin, a colleague and another Senior Solution Architect at Gremlin. So Andre is out on vacation. So any of you big Andre fans that were here to catch him today. Join us again next month. He'll be back then. So we'll kick this off. So today we're going to talk about some essential tests for cloud migrations. Before we do that, again, interactive. Throw your questions in the Q&A panel or the chat. We'll be able to address those either as we're going through or at the end. This is being recorded and will be posted on the office hours site, gremlin afterwards, and will be available for review there shortly. So, jumping right into this, first we'll look at kind of what makes cloud different from on-prem, go over a few tests. We'll do a brief demo more around showing how to set up the test and kind of different ways you can run those tests. And then, of course, we'll wrap up with the Q&A. So, main goal, right? Figure out how cloud is different from on-prem, what issues might we run into when we are migrating an application to cloud. And then secondly, we're going to do some looks, do some tests to kind of see what we can do to help mitigate those risks during the cloud migration process. One of the big changes from going on-prem to cloud is latency. As we all know, pretty much everything in the cloud goes over the network, whether it's just between services or maybe you're using a cloud hosted service, an RDS database, something of that nature. But the more network we add in, the more latency that we have. So this chart just kind of shows some of the ping times, so just response times. So we can see some of these are very low in the, single digit milliseconds, but there are some of these, if you start going between regions or, different locations around the globe, we can see those times start to be, closer to a second. So, it may or may not matter a whole lot. It really kind of depends on your application and how many network calls your application is making. If you're making one call, a half a second may not be a huge deal, but if you're making tens or hundreds of calls, that can really add up. So that's kind of one of the main things that we want to look at here. Problem number two, scalability. So cloud vendors say, it's easy, there's infinite scalability, all that kind of good stuff. EC2s, for example, you can tell AWS how many instances you want. AWS will handle that, add the instances on demand. The problem is it's not instantaneous, right? You have to trick the alerts, you have to wait for those instances to come up. Usually that can take anywhere from 5, 10, 15 minutes in some cases. So it's not an instantaneous, fix to a capacity spike on your side. So you need to kind of test and see what does that look like in my environment, and and adjust your thresholds to make sure that you have time for that auto scaling to be successful and to help out with that the additional load requirement. One last thing we'll touch on real quick is redundancy. So, moving to cloud platforms, you have the concept of regions and zones, all that good stuff. Zones uses two things, isolation and redundancy. So isolation is so that if one zone fails, the others don't go down with it. Same goes for regions, just on a larger, more geographic dispersed scale. Like with scalability, it's up to you as a cloud customer to set up the redundant systems, make sure that your systems are designed to take advantage of the redundancy that the cloud offers. But the flip side of that is it can be complex, and especially if you're moving from an on-prem platform, your application may not be designed to handle that. So those are just a few of the cloud problems that you can potentially run into that affect applications in different ways, and how do we determine whether our services are able to handle them? And of course, one way is to use Gremlin. So Gremlin has a pre-built set of test suites or tests that you can define your services into Gremlin and run different types of failure modes and different scenarios to test things like zone redundancy, CPU spikes, to test your auto scaling, that sort of thing. So there's a couple of different ways we can do this, right? We'll talk about these. We can use services and test suites. We can also just do experiments and scenarios, kind of going back to the earlier days of chaos engineering. those kind of give us a way to test these before we make that jump into the cloud environments. All right. The here. So which tests should we run? So this is a list. So kind of some best practices. We've done several cloud migrations with various customers. These are some of the things that are most likely to present as problems. So, how does my service perform under higher latency? So you can do latency tests inside of Gremlin, see how your application responds, how much does that actually compound when you start making multiple network calls, that sort of thing. So we'll kind of talk through how to do that. Is my service resource constrained? So, does it scale when I have a CPU spike? I have lots of additional users come in or whatever my case may be. Uh, you know, does my auto scaling kick in soon enough? And how soon does the available capacity, spin up and become available to help with that service? Is my service redundant? Can I lose a node or a container? So we can run shutdown experiments inside Gremlin to restart the host, restart the containers, make sure that you're redundant and resilient to those sorts of activities. Um, how does my service handle zone or region outages? So that's one of the big test cases for Gremlin, being able to simulate a zone outage. And we've done those demos previously. Um, but how does my application handle that zone outage if a specific zone has an issue, experiences an outage of some sort, maybe it's additional latency, maybe that zone completely drops for some period of time. How does my application respond to that? And then finally, do I have any expiring TLS certificates? So, this is kind of key in cloud since, so many of the cloud services and the different components will use TLS for encryption, making sure those keys are not going to expire and cause an outage at an inconvenient time is always a good thing as well. With that, we will jump on into the demo. So, um, had a few things we've done. So we've done like zone outages and things like that in the past, right? So we've kind of covered those. We've talked about those. We'll touch on those again here in a second. One thing I did, I just wanted to do this. So this is an example of horizontal pod auto scaling. So using EKS, I set up a HPA, and then I use Gremlin to run a CPU experiment to trigger that auto scaling event. So if we take a peek at my terminal output here, we can see that my front end pod is running. I've got it set for a minimum of 3 pods, max of 6, and then this replicas column, of course, shows us how many replicas we're actually running at the time. So we can see I'm running my minimum of 3. My CPU spike kicks in, so I launch my Gremlin CPU attack or experiment, and we see the CPU spike up to 136, 129%. That's enough to trigger my auto scaling. So my HPA kicked in. It EKS automatically scaled up my replicas to 6, which brings the average down to 64, 65% across my replicas. And so that is maintained. So that's a good sign. So we're able to maintain that with that. And then we can see when I stop the Gremlin experiment, stop the CPU usage drops dramatically back down to single digits, 0, 1%. And uh, we see the timeout. So EKS will wait for a specified amount of time before it scales back down to make sure that that load doesn't creep back up. So that hangs out for a few minutes, and we see the number of replicas slowly come back down to 5 and then back to the original 3 to kind of show that works. So this gives me a good mechanism to test my auto scaling. How long does my CPU spike have to be before my auto scaling kicks in, and that sort of thing. With that, we'll kind of jump into the Gremlin UI. So there's a couple of different ways we can address this. First, and probably the easiest way, is through services or the reliability management piece of Gremlin. So through the test suites, this is the same front-end service I did the horizontal pod auto scaling on. So this front-end service, this will run a CPU test that should trigger that auto scaling to test that that works. Memory, same type of a thing. That could be an auto scaling test. It could be disk I/O. Redundancy, we have host and zone failure. So those are those, pod restarts or host restart tests that we talked about as one of the 5 tests that you should run. Zone failure, same type of thing. This simulates a zone outage, so we can make sure that our workloads are dispersed across the different availability zones. We can black hole or block access to one of the zones to simulate that failure of that outage. We'll be able to test that and see how that works. I also added a redundancy test in here, so this will add redundancy to my front-end service. So everything inbound and outbound will add, 100 milliseconds of latency or however much latency I want to add, just to get a good idea there. And then through the Gremlin agent, we will of course auto detect all your dependencies. So we'll see all the dependencies that you have. So maybe it's other services in the cluster. Maybe we're talking out to, maybe it's a database or authentication service that's running on-prem. So really, regardless of where that is, we'll see those dependencies. Out of the box, we'll run failure tests, latency tests, and certificate expiration tests against those to kind of give you an easy button to test those few things that you need to test for a cloud migration. These tests, of course, are all configurable, so we set those up through test suites. You'll notice when you log into your Gremlin accounts, you have the recommended test and you have this well-architected cloud test. So the well-architected cloud is one that kind of covers most of these use cases. If we look at the test for this gives us all of the different tests that we're going to run. Of course, I can customize this, so if there's additional tests, different things I'm worried about based on my application or the components of my application. I can create those scenarios, add that to the test suite, and run it through there. Of course, if we don't have services set up and fully configured, or we don't have a health check to use, we can use the traditional chaos engineering tools. So we can run experiments and scenarios. So I can run, black holes, CPU tests, all that kind of stuff manually through the experiments. And of course, I can create scenarios to run here as well. So I could do this parallel CPU and memory tests. I can do the different types of latency. I could do zone failures through scenarios very easily. So this just gives me another way to either proactively test this or, as we encounter issues, be able to recreate these, solve these issues as we go. So with that, we can wrap this back up and we'll open it up to Q&A. So we've touched on that, we've done that, and yep, we are ready for Q&A and any other questions. So with that, anybody has any questions, feel free to throw those into the chat or the Q&A. Don and I are here to answer those, and we will kind of go from there. And it does look like we can unmute people as well. So if anybody wants to come off mute and ask a question, just let us know. We can unmute you as well, and you can ask a question. All right. Tim is the first one to throw a question in, and completely fine. The questions don't have to be necessarily on topic. It can be anything kind of Gremlin related. Um, so yeah, feel free to ask any question around Gremlin. It doesn't have to be around the cloud migration piece. This is just a open Q&A. Do we have any customers that use our software to test conference software? What do you mean by conference software? Are you referring to like a voice over IP or some other type of software? Yeah, Tim, if you can give us a little bit more of a background on or a context on what you mean by conference software, that would be good. Emmanuel, where we define a Gremlin zone tag for service availability. Yeah, we can talk about that real quick. So by default, that will use the zone tags that are provided by the cloud provider. So AWS or Azure or GCP or whichever. So by default, we'll use these zone tags that are pulled in from the agent. So AWS by default will assign a zone tag to all the different components. So we'll use these. Now, you can do this if for some reason you don't have the zone tag or you want to be more granular or more specific about that. You can use the custom tagging feature inside of Gremlin and define those custom tags to use that as targeting as well. But this is the easiest place or the I guess the default place, and this is what you will see even if I go to run an experiment, right? If I click on my Kubernetes cluster here, use this, we'll pick that. So we can see, let's use those. That actually shows a little bit easier. So if I look at like EC2 instances, for example, or I can also look at this from a Kubernetes host perspective. So the zone tags for the different zones in AWS are populated here. They'll also be pulled up under the provider tags inside of the experiment. So if we choose let's see, if we choose a zone, choose network black hole. You'll also see those tags in this drop down here. So you can scroll down just a little bit and you'll see the AZID tags. So these are the same availability zone IDs, so it makes it easy to select those just from the tags provided by the cloud provider. All right. Any other questions? And Tim, if you want to throw some more information on what you mean by, there you go. Okay. So I don't know of anyone that specifically uses like the conference software like that. Don, feel free to chime in if you have any customers doing that. But for the most part, I mean, all of those components are, talking over IP or certain ports, that sort of thing. So you could absolutely use Gremlin to impact those. It's just a matter of understanding how the application works, where it's talking, how it's talking, and then designing the experiment. So that's a good scenario of how you can reach out, get a hold of Don, myself, one of the other SAs, and be able to, we can kind of help you look at your architecture diagram and help you to kind of design a test plan and maybe some things that you might want to test. Um, that depending on where those pieces run, you have different options as far as the tests that are available to you. If you can install an agent there, it gives you a little bit more flexibility. If it's a hosted service inside of AWS or Azure or some other cloud platform, you may or may not have that full flexibility to install the agent and run all the tests, but it does, you can still usually do latency, black hole, network-based attacks to those pieces. So those are great to do that. So yeah, Tim, definitely reach out. And like I said, I'm in Fort Collins, just north of you, it looks like. So happy to work with that work with you on that, and we can figure that out for you. Any other questions? On topic, off topic? There we go. Services in the left-hand nav. So Mark, if you don't see services on the left-hand nav, that's probably a licensing thing. So it should show up on the left-hand tab. If you don't see services, it probably means that you're on an older licensing model. Used to we license some of the chaos engineering components separately from the RM piece. It's now more of a singular all-you-can-eat package, but there are some customers that are still on the older model. So just reach out to us. We can enable that for you, or at least turn it on so you can try it and see what that works. But that's more than likely what you're seeing there. Um, so yeah, Mark, if you want to just let us know, I'll just put my email here in the chat and feel free to reach out and I can take a look at your account as well and see what's going on with that. All right. Don, any thoughts, questions? I know you've done some large cloud migrations with some banking customers and that sort of thing. Any other thoughts that we didn't cover today that might be helpful that we could throw out?
Not, I mean, not much that you didn't cover. Certainly, we've seen some large scale use cases, especially for cloud migration, where large financial institutions are using Gremlin to prepare for the impact of moving services from on-prem to the cloud. So using latency to simulate the increased latency that they'll experience between the on-prem services communicating with migrated cloud services. They're able to prepare, predict, and maybe tune their services to better support a hybrid environment of cloud and on-prem. So it protects them from having to, migrate a service and then suddenly seeing major impact to their overall services and offerings to their customers.
Sure. And that can really be done at any scale as well. So, we have customers that will do this for individual applications or components of applications that they're moving to cloud, but we also have customers that will do this on a very large scale. So maybe they're moving, everything to cloud, more of a
Mhm.
moving everything. So they want to do the latency or the zone failure type test at a larger scale. Maybe that's after they get to cloud. We also have customers that will set this up and run kind of a zone failure in an on-prem environment. And so you can do that with the custom tags. You can set up those zone tests and kind of run this across your larger environment. So it really depends on where you want to do that testing, and at what scale you want to do that testing. But either way, you can set that up and accomplish that. And we've done quite a bit of work on those, so happy to help guide you through that process if needed. All right. If there is no other questions, just a quick reminder, go to gremlin.com/office hours. We're working on posting and scheduling the next few sessions, so we'll be working on that. So if there's any other topics or anything that you'd like us to cover, feel free to do that. And the recording will be posted, I believe it goes to that same gremlin.com/office hours site. So the recording will be wrapped up and published out there here shortly, probably in the next day or so. Sounds good. Thanks everybody for joining and enjoy the rest of your week.